Hello, Professor Morgan here, sharing a little video on something in creative writing called bushwhacking. What does that even mean? So that's a term sometimes called when you're writing off the beaten path, as you're not just taking the normal path that people kind of expect. So let's kind of get into it and kind of give you some examples here. So let me start with a little story. So I'm old, and one of the shows that I loved watching growing up was a show called MASH, and this is the character Hawkeye in MASH, and he is. This takes place during the Korean War, and he's a surgeon. And there's a scene where he is there's so he works at a hospital, a mobile hospital, and there's a scene where people, an injured young man had come in from from the war, or police action, whatever they called it, and he's Hawkeye's treating him. There's some wounds, but the guy's lucid and he can talk to him and whatever. And Hawkeye asked the kid, asked the young man. He's like, "Well, so where are you from?" And the guy says, "Oh, I'm from someplace, Indiana." And Hawkeye's like, "Oh, yeah, yeah. That's the town that's got like the dealership that whenever they have the new cars come out, they've got the spotlights that go up." And he's like, "Yeah." And then the young man names the name of the dealership, and he's like, "Yeah." And then there's that restaurant on the edge of the town that has like the greasiest fries. And their food's not that great, but like everyone eats there. He's like, "Yeah, yeah, someone plays," and he does this for a few more things. And the patient says to Hawkeye, he said, "Are you so? When have you been to this? When have you been to my hometown?" And Hawkeye said, "I haven't. I grew up in the same small town in Maine, and that really struck me. And I've thought about that for years at a time because I'm like, there's so many commonalities in storytelling, and it's like things that you just kind of expect, that it's like, oh yeah, okay, so this genre is fantasy, or it's romance, or it's science fiction, or it's a western, or it's a thriller, or it's a mystery, and these are the things that you're gonna just expect. It's just the same little town in a different state or something like that. So that's kind of the thought process when I got thinking about bushwhacking. Now, the idea of, when it comes to storytelling and bushwhacking, so imagine you're driving down this road and you're like, okay, well, I'm telling a story, and, there's a very clear path that I'm taking because, yeah, I know the characters, I know, where they're headed, and, you know, the tropes of this genre would be, yeah, just to follow this path. Well, what happens if you go off the path? Okay, and you decide, hey, I'm gonna go over here and take this path over here into this uncharted area. That's the whole idea of bushwhacking, where you have to whack the bushes out of the way to see what else is out there. You're still in the forest, you're still in the same area, you're still whatever, but you may be uncovering things that are unexpected, and now that can actually really make your story a lot more interesting. But it can also go really badly if you decide to go too far off the beaten path, because then people are like, what is going on here? But sometimes it's the idea of risk versus reward, okay? There are times that I've like finished reading a book and I'm like, yep, that is exactly what I expected, and it's that same little town, you know, in Indiana that or the same little town in Maine that I grew up in, but this one takes place in Indiana, where it's just almost like right by the numbers, right? It's like this happens and this happens and this happens, and it's very common story beats and plot elements and stuff like that. So the idea of going off path. Now, I'll give you an example. My first book is called The Hidden Sun, and this is actually the third edition of it. And so I wrote this before I earned my MFA, and I wrote this in my early 40s. I didn't. I mean, I had read a ton when I was a kid because again, I was born before the internet and we had three TV stations, so I read a lot. So I understood kind of basic storytelling and I hadn't really studied it too much. But I had an idea for a story and I had an idea of some things that I wanted to do. And so major spoiler alert. Okay, so the story starts off in a very it takes place in medieval times. There's no magic involved. I really wanted to create a story where you had folks dealing with challenges and obstacles where they couldn't use magic or technology to solve them. And there's political stuff, there's action, there's adventure, there's stuff with romance, and I mean just kind of more of a human. Anyway, so I start writing the story, and in chapter 8 of the story, or chapter 9, depending on which version of the book you read, um, I kill off one of the main characters. Okay, and it is, and I had people get really upset at me, like really upset at me, like upset at me, like okay, this is I don't know why this picture just reminds me of this, because I wrote the book for my daughters, and I mean I had people like be like, I just put the book down and I didn't want to read anymore because I was so upset because I become so attached to that character and how could you possibly kill them off? And I'm like, just keep reading the book. And the people, and they would, and when they were done, they're like, okay, now I get why you did it. And so I did some bushwhacking. I went off the beaten track, and I'm not saying you have to kill off a major character to go bushwhacking, but I decided instead of me following this path of like, what is this going to be? What would be the consequences, and how would my characters change if there was such a dramatic change in something like this, and how it kind of went off the beaten path. And actually a lot of people really, I mean, in the end a lot of people really enjoyed it because it was not what they expected and it wasn't on the beaten path. And okay, a little insight here. The main reason why I killed off the main character was that I really wanted there to be a sense that nobody was safe in this book, and that when people faced consequences, there were actual sincere, you know, possibilities that it's not going to go the way that they're going to, whatever. You just don't expect everything to work out just fine because that's just the way it's going to go. Okay. Um, and that kind of built the tension. That was my intent, and that's kind of what was pulled off. So, okay. So now, going off the beaten path is not the same as Deus ex machina, and we're not going to get too far into this. This is basically where you have something happen that solves a problem that comes out of nowhere. This is kind of like, I think it's like Latin for God in the machine, God in the machine. And an example of Deus ex machina is the end of Jurassic Park, the movie. Okay, where the people are running for their lives. They're being chased by the raptors. There's no hope. And all of a sudden, boom, the T-Rex comes out and grabs one of the raptors, and then the other raptor decides to attack the T-Rex. Where'd the T-Rex come from? Okay, why did he not attack the people? Okay, he just kind of came out of left field. It's like you didn't expect it, and it really wasn't set up well enough to be a thing. Another example would be the Superman movie from the 70s, where, again, major spoiler alert, in the end of the first movie, Lois Lane dies. And Superman's not happy with that. So what he does is that he flies as fast as he can against the rotation of the Earth and causes the Earth to go spin backwards and causes time to go backwards so he can save Lois Lane. What? Where did this come from? How do we know that he could do this? Right? It came out of nowhere. And it was like, well, that's kind of a cheap way to solve that problem. So that's not the same as that. Okay, so some final thoughts when it comes to bushwhacking is, I would say, really in the first drafts when we're writing, be okay with maybe, as an idea comes up to you, think, well, what would happen if this, whatever. Because again, revision is part of the writing process. And for me personally, the best ideas that I've had for books, um, and the best, story plot elements are things that I hadn't expected until I decided to go off the beaten path and say, what if this thing's happened? And it's amazing what does, can transpire. So there's the insight on bushwhacking when it comes to writing.